did the aliens have ears? Right? I mean, it's like, okay, music was a bad choice, right? If they just don't have that sensory experience, and even if they do, even if they have, as you might say, some auditory experience, to what extent, there's all sorts of levels right there from the basic psychological. Do they hear octaves as the same note the way we do, right?
Hello from the children of planet Earth.
If you can just start off with your name and what you do.
Yeah, I'm Andrew Kania. I'm a philosopher. I teach at Trinity University in San Antonio in the United States, though I'm originally from New Zealand. And I specialize in philosophy of the arts, particularly philosophy of music.
I mean, it must be super interesting. So I like reading a bit about what you're doing is essentially you're not just looking at music as well, but there's also the philosophy of film, video games, literature, all of these different realms. Do you find there's a lot of sort of connecting lines between the different medias, or?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I feel like that's been a big topic in philosophy of the arts in the last maybe up to 50 years. I think historically there was this tradition in the West, at least, Western philosophy, of kind of thinking of the arts as this kind of unified field of human activity in some way, and attempt to find something that unifies them all. And like traditionally in the West, that was aesthetic experience somehow. And in the 20th century, I feel like that broke down a lot, and partly it was like, the fragmentation of the arts and people doing kind of radical new avant-garde stuff that really broke the tradition. And one way in which that was kind of reflected was that theories of the arts became much more kind of fragmented and disunified. And some people thought that maybe it was even a mistake to treat all the arts together, and we should just be kind of talking about music and talking about literature and talking about dance or whatever, instead of talking about the arts as a whole. And yet there's still a sense that a lot of these things kind of go together in some way. And of course there are lots of crossovers. Like, it seems like some arts are particularly narrative. So if you think of like film, and even these days video games, and literature of certain sorts, like that's very narrative, whereas we don't think of maybe painting or sculpture as narrative so much. And music's always been a kind of an interesting kind of difficult case, because there's been this sense that in some way it's non-representational. So it's been kind of abstract, as it were, for a long time, when abstraction really only came to the fore in painting, for instance, in the 20th century. There was a sense in which music was considered abstract for a long time. So yeah, there's been a lot of discussion, I think, about like where the connections are and where they aren't. And I think I've done some work on both sides of that question. Some people have done, for instance, work on video games, saying that they're similar to music or similar to literature in some ways. And I've sort of pushed back against that and said, no, they're different. You've got to kind of think of them, freshly, with sorts of fresh eyes. But on the other hand, I think there are important connections.
So you mentioned aesthetic, and in my sort of limited idea of its aesthetic would just be literally just what looks pretty. But I'm guessing there's going to be a little bit more of an explanation to like how we actually break down perception. Is there a universal idea of what is beautiful and not beautiful?
I think, again, historically, the idea has been to be very kind of universalist about it, at least, again, in the thought of the West. So the idea is that somehow the perception of beauty is connected with our cognitive faculties that all human beings share. And I would say, again, in the 20th century, there's been a lot more focus on the ways that those faculties are heavily dependent on or reflected by kind of cultural differences and even individual differences. So there's much more skepticism, I would say, in philosophy and other disciplines that look at the arts about the idea that certain kinds of beauty are universal. On the other hand, I'm sympathetic to a view that's kind of tries to kind of have it both ways, I guess, in a sense. I do think that we that all human beings share certain kind of cognitive resources which get expressed in very different ways in different cultures. But that doesn't make those other cultures inaccessible to us. So it's a little bit like language, right? It's impossible to understand somebody who speaks a different language at first. But because all human languages share some kind of deep structures, we're all capable of learning the languages of other cultures. And I think the same is true of art and things like beauty, right? Things that other cultures find beautiful, we might at first find kind of strange that that's what they consider beautiful, and vice versa. But we can enculturate ourselves.
I think also the beauty also about this project as well is we get to look at it sort of from a universal, like if we now include aliens into this conversation, like
right.
We think it's beautiful. So there was a part of sort of the creation of the first record where there's essentially 3 Buck songs, and obviously that meant leaving out a couple of other songs, but these songs were put in because of their amazing structure and the message of something that we find incredibly beautiful, but there's actually such a beautiful structure to those particular songs that there was an idea at the time that those songs would be seen as universally beautiful in any part of the galaxy or any part of the universe.
But then, I mean, as you say, when you start thinking about what might be truly universal, not just universal amongst human beings, but universal across species from a totally different environment, there is something tempting about the idea that more kind of mathematical and simple kind of structural features seem to have a better chance of being communicable across those barriers. But it also seems like, I mean, just think about the music, right? I mean, you put a Bach fugue on the record, for instance. It's like, did the aliens have ears, right? I mean, it's like, okay, music was a bad choice, right? If they just don't have that sensory experience. And even if they do, even if they have, as you might say, some auditory experience, to what extent, there's all sorts of levels right there from the basic psychological. Do they hear octaves as the same note the way we do, right? I mean, if they don't have that sort of experience of sounds, they are not going to hear the music in the Bach, right? Which is going to be a very difficult bridge to cross.
Sure. I think like it's similar to like we see in a certain spectrum of light, and there's so much else that is in other spectrums of light that we're just not seeing. You know, an alien might have their ears tuned to a different sort of realm. I think that one of the things that we're really focusing on in this particular iteration of the record is sort of this cultural experience. And I was told in a not so nice manner that, I have to understand that like Indian music on a 7 beats is far more advanced than my simple 4-beat rhythm is used to. And I'm like, just because it doesn't sound beautiful to me, that's more of my fallibility than it is that whole sort of region of music's, what that is.
Right, absolutely. But then, of course, in a way, the scary thought is, right, well, if you, another human being, can't kind of easily hear the music in the sounds of another culture, like how much more difficult is it going to be for a creature with a totally different biology? And so in a sense, I sort of feel like, you want to kind of split the difference somehow. I mean, be as wide as possible, maybe. In a sense, you want to like show off and say, listen to this Indian raga. It's, a high achievement of human culture. But on the other hand, you might want something really simple, like just kind of a scale or something, because that seems like it's got more chance of getting across, right, to some being who's totally different from us.
I mean, maybe the better question is, what would you like to see on the record?
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question, both in terms of content and, as you say, sort of methodology for how to decide. I mean, I guess the ideal would be something like very as kind of representative as possible. Now, of course, you've got these big problematic questions, as we were talking about earlier, sort of like, well, what are the aliens most likely to understand? So if you think of that in terms of practical issues, it's very difficult to know how even to get started, I think. But if you kind of reduce the question in a big way, so for instance, I think about music a lot. Suppose you decide that you're going to put some music on the record. You want to have are kind of as representative a sample of global and historical music as you possibly can have. And I think even that's going to be very difficult to figure out how you're going to do it. Like, I mean, there's just so many musical cultures in the world and have been across time. And of course, we've lost a lot of stuff from the past because we don't have good records of music, even in terms of like notations from, before a few hundred years ago. And I think there's a tendency, I mean, I'd be interested to see the track list for the original Golden Record, because I wouldn't be surprised if it's quite Western music heavy. I think you mentioned there were like maybe 3 tracks of Bach on there, and it seems like, geez, 3 out of, if it was a maybe you see 20 tracks, yeah. So it's like Bach gets 3 of them. It's like, wow, that's really putting him up there in terms of representing humanity. And it seems like, geez, if the aliens understand one Bach piece, they're going to understand the others okay. Like, better to kind of spread your bets a little bit. So I think lots of different kinds of music would be a good idea. And I don't know if this is ironic, but one of the odd things about going kind of with public voting in terms of making the decisions is, of course, depending on how representative your voters are, that's going to affect how representative your sample is, right? So it's like, presumably this is going to happen over the internet, so you're going to get more music that's familiar to people who have easy access to the internet, which is going to cut out a big chunk of people across the globe, right? Unless, of course, you can kind of communicate this to the voters and they kind of, vote accordingly. But I think, yeah, I mean, I would definitely, as a philosopher, I would want to bring on, anthropologists, particularly cultural anthropologists, to kind of think about, well, how are we going to think about how to get a representation of human cultures, and then how are we going to, how does it make sense to kind of represent the music of those cultures? And even that, right? I mean, it's good that you've got a long time, Warren, because it seems like even that's going to be a really difficult question. And once again, I've just reduced it to suppose we've agreed to put music on there at all. And if you're thinking about, well, what else are we going to put on there? I mean, as you say, that we can encode so much data in such a small space now that those questions are not as pressing as with the original Golden Record. So presumably we'll go big in terms of lots of different kinds of cultural artifacts.
So this idea would be essentially to bring together, we do have 2 social anthropologists on the team as well, but to bring together a team of people, put together 2 scientific papers on how to collect this information, and give people the opportunity to vote within sort of representative categories. So for music, it could be sort of pre-1950s Western music, post-1950s Western music as 2 categories. Maybe Asian or Southeast Asian, African. And I think also, with you sort of, I think that is really sort of part of the conversation, is really how we would distinguish or determine to getting a representation. If we say, looked at maybe 12 different categories, can we break music down into 10 or 12 categories? Is it possible?
Right. Yeah. I mean, interesting question. And I would, yeah. My first thought would be more categories if we've got the space, just because, yeah, those groups are so huge, right? There's so much diversity of music in any one of those categories. But of course, at some point you've got to draw the lines for a project like this. So yeah, you've just got to think about how much space do we have, and how many categories can we get. But I definitely lean in the direction of just one representative from any given category.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously I've been thinking a lot about sort of what it means to be human, and I think music is such an important, I think for me, and maybe I am biased in with the amounts of music that I listen to and sort of how much I'm drawn to music, but I think the humanities and the arts, are really an important representation of what it means to be human. I mean, Carl Sagan was quite famously quoted saying, we don't want to show off by sending anything that's too fancy. But this is when you walk into a dinner party, you start off with your best foot. There was an idea to somebody had wanted to put on a nuclear explosion going off, and sort of the pushback on that is, firstly, you didn't want anything that was going to sort of show aggression, but also we're sort of telling our story as of what we would maybe not aspire to be, but what we would like the rest of the universe to know about us.
When it comes to sort of cultural stuff like music, it seems like you'd want to do both that and also something that's more, again, like representative. In which case, I don't know how you do this exactly, but you find, but for each of those, cultural or geographic groups you were talking about, find the song that's familiar to the most people. And if that ends up being like Happy Birthday, like maybe that's quite helpful, right? To give a kind of sense of more like kind of the average or the median or some more sort of typicality for us. That would be more helpful in a way, I think, for understanding humanity.
Yeah.
But it would definitely be
yeah, sure. Even to have, children's songs as well are such an interesting part of our history and sort of a great storyteller of sort of who we are in humanity. And there's always this question of, are we sort of heavily focused on our past, on where we are today, where we aspire to? All of these things would sort of come into this. There has been sort of some discussion around creating essentially a maybe a course for aliens to learn a language, and whether that be English or a language that is essentially makes the rest of the records sort of more understandable. So I think this came out of robotics. In robotics, that's sort of the holy grail of robotics is to design a humanoid robot, because over the last couple of thousand years, we've been designing things that are sized as a human. A table is a certain size, a seat is a certain size. And if you can get a robot to fit into that, you don't have to redesign the rest of the world to fit the robots type of thing. I wonder what your thoughts are on something like that.
I think when it comes to music and other kind of cultural stuff, it's not clear to me there'll be like an easy way to do that, because again, it seems so certainly culturally specific, but more importantly, potentially like cognitively specific. It's like either they're going to kind of get this or they aren't. You could do, an octave and then an octave and a fifth and then a scale and then a little melody in that. But of course, in some sense, you'd I'd have to pick one musical language, as it were, or you'd have to do this for like every example of music you put on the record. And in a way, I feel like that's more complicated.
Is Happy Birthday universal globally in the world?
Only the extent, that's definitely in a Western tonal musical language. So it might be universal in the sense that, Western culture has been so kind of dominant and spread so much through the world for various kind of socioeconomic reasons. But it's not in a universal musical language, as it were. I would say there is no universal musical language. I think there are, now this is partly my own view, but other people would disagree. There are some basics, a little bit like in human languages, right? As I understand it, it's pretty universal to have a distinction between a noun and a verb, for instance. It seems to me, and here I've just drawn on the work of music psychologists, really, universal to have the octave. So, if there are any listeners who don't know what an octave is, right, it's a very familiar phenomenon. So if I sing this note and then I sing this note, it's like the same note but at a different height. This is the low one, this is the high one. And hearing that idea that those two notes are the same but different in a height sense. Another big question there is like, why do we use height language to talk about this? Doesn't seem like literally higher or lower. That seems culturally universal. The idea of an octave as the same note repeated. And then it also seems universal to have a kind of, as it were, secondary note. So in in Western tonal harmony, we talk about this as the dominant. So if I start with that note again, this is the dominant, and when you hear that note in a melody, you want it to go back down to the bottom note. It gets frustrating if you don't go there, but that's the home note, right? So you've got a division between kind of the octave, which is the home note, and the dominant, which is kind of, away, because it creates tension, right? You want to come back to the home note. That also seems to be pretty culturally universal. And then I think it also seems culturally universal for people to divide up the octave into steps. So as opposed to hearing, obviously we know that sound is a kind of continuum, right? If I go from there, I was like, there's all sorts of frequencies in there, and you can get them finer and finer. But in musical cultures, we tend to chunk out the octave into steps. And that's what we might call scales, right, in the West. But that's something that there's huge variation across the globe with, across different cultures. Different ways of dividing the octave into scales. And so, to go back to your happy birthday question, that's definitely in a kind of Western tonal scale. And so, someone who's grown up, only exposed to some other musical culture, I mean, they can obviously hear the sounds, but they're not going to hear those sounds sort of as the completed melody that people who've been enculturated in Western music are going to hear it in. Just as when someone like me, right, I know nothing about Chinese opera. If I hear Chinese opera, I mean, I can hear all the sounds, obviously, but I don't really hear the music in the sounds, right, because I'm not familiar with that musical language. So my understanding is that people who are not familiar with Western tonal harmony will hear Happy Birthday in a similar sort of way. It won't make the same sense to them as it makes to people who are familiar with that tonal language.
I wonder around from an instrument perspective, and even from a perspective of the universal on a different planet somewhere else in the universe, whether, banging on a rock is going to make a sound that's going to be the same here as it's going to be there, or the wind through the trees would make that whistling sound. There'll be sort of tonal differences with that. And, if it would then make sense that, we might not have too much of a dissimilar, the advent of music might be common in many different places in the universe. And that there could be sort of some of these commonalities of, if a whale sound that's singing is in some ways, there's a tonal aspect to it maybe, and that's sort of even across species tonal aspect.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of disagreement about this, and again, I think psychologists of music would certainly know more about this than I would. But I think there's a danger of being anthropocentric here, and it brings up the same issues about the aliens, right? We talk about whale song, we talk about bird song, but we don't talk about cat song. But, cats make noises, right? It's like, why do we talk about... Well, we don't talk about cat song in part because it doesn't sound to us like music. That is, it doesn't sound like they're making melodies. So the extent to which there's really a similarity there, and I mean, I think there is. There are interesting similarities between bird song and whale song and human music, and which aren't found in cat song. But I think there's a big danger of us kind of, it sounds like music to us, so we think they must be doing the same kind of thing as we are. But I think that can be quite misleading. On the other hand, we do seem able to tell, if we go to a foreign country, we seem to be able to tell when people are speaking language and when they're making other kinds of sounds, even if we don't understand anything about the language. And so maybe there is something there about how we are detecting that there really is a kind of musical aspect to it in some sense, even though we can't understand the music.
Is there sort of work done on why does music make us feel the way it does? Like where does that sort of connection happen? I taste something that I like, and I think obviously that is my brain is being stimulated in some way there's a dopamine release in that. Is there sort of study on why that is and what and
Yeah, sure. So again, there's lots of sort of psychological literature on that, and the philosophers approach these same questions from a slightly different angle. I mean, just to link it back to something I was saying earlier, it seems like that's, if you ask people like, well, what do you like so much about music, or what do you like so much about that song? They often talk about their emotional response, about how it makes them feel. But notice this is a totally different kind of value of why you think music's important to the formal aesthetic stuff we were talking about earlier, right? You ask people why they really love that song, almost no one is going to say, oh, well, it's so like nicely balanced, like between the verses and the chorus, and, it really forms a kind of, they're going to talk about the emotional impact of the song. So again, at the very kind of high abstract level, it's like, geez, if what's important about music is how it makes us respond emotionally, what are the chances that the aliens are going to respond to the same sounds in the same way? I mean, it seems like, for one thing, you've got to understand the music first, right? I don't respond emotionally in the proper way to Chinese opera because I can't hear the music. So you've got to be able to hear the music first, and then you respond emotionally to that. And I think that's an important part to remember when we talk about it in these scientific terms about, like, dopamine release and stuff. I think there's, I mean, this is going to be a bit of a caricature, and I think psychologists have got a lot better at this in the past few decades. But there's been this tendency to treat music as a kind of sensory stimulus, the same as, like, if you hear a loud noise, you have a kind of startle reaction. But of course, things like a startle reaction to a loud noise are universal. I mean, that's just across humanity. It's much more kind of deeply rooted in our psychology. Whereas emotional responses to music depend on understanding the music in similar ways to, like, understanding literature, right? Poems or something. So it's much more complicated and much more kind of culturally mediated, I would say, than just a basic kind of stimulus. And one of the things that's really important, I think, to think about with respect to emotions in music, and something that, again, it took psychologists a while, well, philosophers too, to kind of latch on to, is this important distinction between emotions in the listener, which we tend to talk about first, and emotions in the music. So if you listen to a fugue by Bach, say, you can identify that it's sad music, right? You can tell the difference between sad and happy music. Again, if you're familiar with Western music. And it's not like that means it always makes you sad. So there's a tendency, I think, for people to assume when we say a piece of music is sad, what do we mean? Well, we mean it makes us sad. But it doesn't seem like it's that simple, because you can judge that a piece of music is sad or happy without it making you sad. Right? You might think, oh, that piece is that's really mortal in that song. I hate it. It makes me angry because, it's so sad. It's like too sad. And so there's definitely a difference between our emotional response to the music and the emotional content of the music. So I think that's an important thing to kind of remember when we're doing things like psychological studies. I think for a long time there was this assumption that sad music is just music that makes us sad, and so we just have to kind of like test how people are responding emotionally. But I think it's more complicated, because you might be responding to the emotion that's in the music and not like just to the sounds as a simple sensory response.
Any recommendation for a type of music that maybe a Western ear is not used to, that you think it deserves some further investigation?
Well, I mean, in the sense, I want to say like all of it. I feel like, if a musical tradition has lasted long enough that a bunch of people are interested in it, you can listen to it. I know some people I have a lot of respect for do work on Balinese gamelan music. So I think that's really interesting, very complicated. Again, I think there's long traditions of Chinese music that are interesting, all sorts of African music. So I just think, anything is better than nothing.
Super. I mean, that's pretty much it. Really appreciate. Welcome also to the team, and
Thanks.
yeah,